Now, sitting at the age of 70, Rosanne Cash has finally decided to peel back the curtain on the complicated reality of June Carter, the woman who not only stole the heart of her father, the legendary Johnny Cash, but who also became one of the most pivotal forces in her entire existence. But to really grasp the gravity of what Rosanne is revealing, you have to first wrap your head around the massive legacy she was born into. Rosanne didn't just grow up with music. She emerged from a bona fide dynasty with her father already standing tall as a titan in the country scene. Then you add her stepmother June, a member of the iconic Carter clan, widely recognised as the original royal family of American folk and country music. These weren't just famous people. Their names were practically stitched into the flag of American pop culture. Their songs didn't just play on the radio, they echoed through decades, fundamentally blueprinting the future of the genre. For Rosanne, this meant her childhood wasn't about reading history in textbooks. It was watching history unfold in her living room, eating breakfast with legends, and seeing her family command every major stage in the nation. However, inheriting that kind of crown comes with crushing expectations, bitter rivalries, and a tangled web of affection and silence that Rosanne is only now feeling brave enough to tear open. You have to understand, Rosanne Cash's upbringing was light years away from the typical American girl's experience. From day one, she was trapped inside a hurricane of headlines, global fame, and emotional turbulence. Born back in 1955 to Johnny Cash and his first wife, Vivian Liberto, her earliest memories were a confusing cocktail of high glamour and absolute chaos. Her dad was a skyrocketing superstar, the Man in Black, who was rewriting the rules of country music with that signature baritone growl and outlaw attitude. But behind the velvet ropes of that stardom lay a household that was cracking under the pressure of long tours, absenteeism, and Johnny's spiralling reliance on pills and alcohol. To young Rosanne, this translated to a father who was a mythical figure to the public, but often a ghost in his own home, painfully out of reach. He was a man worshipped by millions of strangers, yet he struggled to keep it together for the wife and kids who actually needed him. By the time June Carter walked into the frame, Rosanne was still just a kid. She was trying to navigate a confusing world where her father was cheered by crowds but caused nothing but heartache when the front door closed. To her, June wasn't the country darling the rest of the world fell in love with. She was a new, overwhelming energy in her dad's life, bringing equal parts sunshine and storm. Looking back, Rosanne describes those initial feelings as incredibly messy and layered. She couldn't deny June's quick wit, her ability to hold an audience in the palm of her hand, and her intense dedication to Johnny. But underneath that, there was the sharp sting of jealousy and a child's confusion, constantly wondering where she fit into this new, blended family puzzle. Growing up in the colossal shadow of the Carter-Cash merger meant carrying a weight of expectation that would break most adults, let alone a child. Rosanne had to shoulder the heavy burden of the Cash surname and the blinding aura of her father's celebrity status. And then there was the looming presence of June, who rapidly became the glue holding the house together while Johnny fought a very public war with his demons. To the fans reading the tabloids, it looked like the ultimate fairy tale romance. Two massive icons uniting their voices, blending perfectly on the Grand Ole Opry stage, a love story for the ages. But for a young Rosanne watching from the wings, it was a daily high-wire act of looking up to them while also feeling deep resentment, oscillating between comfort and total uncertainty. As the decades rolled on, she would eventually start to view June through a different lens, realising she wasn't just the woman who took her dad, but the force that kept him alive when things could have easily fallen apart. Yet even with that realisation, those emotions were buried under years of silence and unspoken family tension. It was the shaky rhythm of a daughter desperately trying to find her own spotlight within the greatest musical dynasty the country world has ever seen. Rosanne Cash's first real memories of June Carter weren't formed by glossy magazine covers or press releases. They weren't shaped by the thunderous applause of sold-out arenas, but by the raw human moments of a woman stepping into a broken home. June was already a heavyweight champion in the industry before she ever married Johnny. She was born into royalty, a Carter, through and through, armed with a sharp tongue, undeniable comedy chops, and a stage confidence that was impossible to ignore. To the public, she was pure charisma, a magnetic force of nature. She was the type of woman who could brighten the darkest room with a single smile, but to a young Rosanne, she represented something much more threatening. She was the woman who had captured her father's attention right as his marriage to her mother was disintegrating, and that reality sparked emotions that were anything but simple. Rosanne would later confess that her initial view of June was heavily clouded by a mix of awe and deep suspicion. On one side of the coin, June's vibrant energy was impossible to resist. She had this gift for making people feel secure, for filling the silence with laughter, and for pulling Johnny Cash back from the edge when he seemed hell-bent on sinking. But on the flip side, Rosanne couldn't shake the feeling that her father was slipping further away, consumed not just by the madness of addiction and fame, but by a new love that seemed to crowd out everything else. For a child who was just desperate for some stability, June was a walking paradox of comfort and chaos. It was a riddle that young Rosanne found nearly impossible to solve at the time. She can still recall how June's laughter would ring through the hallways, how she could diffuse a screaming match with a joke or a quick song. And yet those very traits sometimes felt like painful reminders that her own mother was gone, replaced by this larger-than-life figure she didn't fully understand. Trying to untangle her own personal grief from June's overpowering, genuine southern warmth was a monumental task for Rosanne, especially as she matured and started to grasp just how deep June's devotion really ran. Even as a grown woman, the young Rosanne carried the emotional bruises and lingering scars from those initial awkward encounters with her famous stepmother. There were plenty of dark moments when she genuinely questioned if June was just another rival competing for her father's limited attention and love. She often felt completely swallowed up by June's electric, magnetic personality, leaving her to quietly wonder where exactly she fit into this chaotic family puzzle. Those early impressions, stacked with the heavy baggage of divorce fame and blended family drama, would stick around for years, colouring the way Rosanne looked at the woman who replaced her mom. It would be a long time before she could look back with 20/20 hindsight and accept the hard truths that only the passage of time could uncover. Let's be real, life inside the Cash estate was about as far from a normal American upbringing as you could possibly get. And the moment June Carter moved her boots in permanently, the whole household dynamic shifted in ways Rosanne wouldn't fully comprehend until she was an adult herself. To the public and the fans, Johnny and June were the ultimate golden couple of Nashville, a perfect harmonious blend of romance and hit records. But behind the curtain, their domestic life was a messy, high-stakes roller coaster filled with equal parts tender affection and absolute turmoil. June immediately had to step up as the family anchor, trying desperately to hold together not just a fragile marriage, but an entire household teetering on the edge. Everything revolved around a man whose massive celebrity status was both a divine blessing and a crushing, heavy burden to bear. She had to be part mother figure, part nurse, part strict warden, and a literal shield against the madness that Johnny often dragged through the front door. For Rosanne, growing up in that pressure cooker meant living under the steady, unyielding rule of June Carter. June was all about structure, old-time religion and discipline, even while the house was being battered by the unpredictable hurricanes of Johnny's addictions and disappearances. Don't get me wrong, June could be incredibly warm and nurturing, the type of southern matriarch who made sure every belly was full and every soul was comforted. But she could also flip the switch and be tough as nails, demanding respect and order in a home that was constantly threatening to spiral into total anarchy. To a young girl like Rosanne, this Jekyll and Hyde duality was confusing. She respected June's grit and saw she was carrying loads that would break most people. And yet there were times when that very strength felt like a suffocating weight, just another reminder of how her childhood was, light years away from that of a normal kid. You simply couldn't ignore June's ride-or-die devotion to Johnny. It was the defining feature of their lives. Rosanne watched with her own eyes as her stepmother pulled her dad back from the cliff's edge more times than she could count. She stood right there in the trenches with him during his darkest hours when the pills, the booze and the fame nearly put him in the ground. That level of loyalty was both awe-inspiring and kind of intimidating, setting a bar for love and sacrifice that Rosanne found impossible to match in her own romances later on. Still, we can't pretend everything was peachy. The tension in that house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rosanne sometimes felt like her voice was totally drowned out in a home dominated by two towering giants, one a global icon and the other a Carter royalty. Family suppers could be full of picking guitars and laughter one night, and then dead silence and thick resentment the next evening. Yet even in those incredibly awkward moments, Rosanne could see that June was the superglue keeping the whole operation from shattering into a million pieces. Looking back now, Rosanne admits that a lot of what she thought was friction was actually just her own internal confusion projecting out. She was just a child caught in the crossfire between admiration for this woman and a deep-seated resentment of the situation. June wasn't a saint, but she was steadfast, and in the stormy reality of living with the man in black, that consistency was the only thing preventing a total collapse. As Rosanne Cash matured, her entry into the music business felt like it was destined in the stars, but also absolutely terrifying. On one hand, country music was in her DNA, the natural inheritance of being Johnny Cash's daughter and a part of the legendary Carter family clan. On the other hand, that same bloodline came with a crushing, suffocating weight of expectation that few could understand. How are you supposed to step into the spotlight when your daddy is a music god and your stepmom is practically royalty in the industry? Rosanne has openly admitted she wrestled constantly with the fear of being seen as just a cheap knockoff rather than a true artist. When she finally decided to chase her own career, she kept it quiet at first, needing to prove to herself she could stand on her own 2 feet without the family name propping her up. This was back before the critics, and the world started comparing her every move to the legend she was tied to by blood and marriage. June Carter, for her part, was a massive source of encouragement, but she was also a walking, breathing reminder of the impossible standards Rosanne was facing. June never forced Rosanne to grab a mic. If anything, she pushed her to be her own woman and find a voice that was uniquely hers. But just her presence in the room was enough to remind Rosanne of the incredibly high bar she was trying to reach. In interviews, Rosanne has recalled moments where June dropped some heavy wisdom, telling her that music is about truth, not technical perfection, that fans will forgive a missed note, but they'll never forgive a liar. Those lessons stuck to Rosanne's ribs, shaping her entire philosophy as a songwriter for decades to come. It's no wonder she would later be hailed by critics for her lyrical depth and raw emotional authenticity. Still, there were plenty of times Rosanne felt the cold shadow of June's influence, wondering if her wins would ever be just hers or if they'd always be tied to the Cash-Carter dynasty. When Rosanne finally released her. With those first few albums, she didn't just work hard. She fought a relentless battle to divorce her own identity from the colossal weight of her famous last name. While she never completely rejected the significance of her roots, she was absolutely determined to carve out a unique lane for her artistry, separate from the family empire. June supported her from the sidelines, careful never to steal the spotlight, but always observing with a quiet, steady pride that spoke volumes. Rosanne would later reveal that although their personal relationship had its fair share of private tension, June never once attempted to dictate the direction of her music. She never tried to force Rosanne into a pre-packaged country mould. Instead, she granted her the dangerous freedom to stumble, crash, and eventually rise entirely on her own terms. That delicate balance of offering guidance without interference was a parenting strategy Rosanne only truly understood decades down the road. Back then, in the heat of the moment, it often felt like June was being distant, acting aloof, or simply refusing to step in when things got tough. But the reality was far more profound. She was bestowing upon Rosanne the ultimate gift a stepmother could give, the opportunity to forge a self-made character completely unshackled from constant comparison. This was no small feat in a dynasty where escaping comparison was nearly impossible. Yet, in hindsight, Rosanne credits June for teaching her that a massive legacy does not have to be a heavy chain. It can actually serve as a solid foundation, provided you have the courage to build something new upon it, rather than just living in its basement. Despite all the genuine love, backing and wisdom June Carter introduced into Rosanne Cash's world, their dynamic was never without its deep, silent struggles. There were lingering moments of unspoken friction that seemed to occupy the quiet, empty spaces between the two women. Rosanne has confessed that growing up in a home where two absolute legends stood at the centre created a perpetual sense of being invisible or overshadowed. June, with her razor-sharp wit, endless chaotic energy and profound spiritual depth, was simply one of those figures who sucked the air out of the room and commanded attention without trying. For a young woman attempting to construct her own sense of self, living alongside that kind of magnetic presence could feel absolutely suffocating. Rosanne frequently found herself trapped in an emotional limbo, caught somewhere between intense admiration and a biting sense of envy. She was torn between being thankful for June's ability to keep her father's chaotic world from imploding and the nagging heartbreak of feeling like her own mother Vivian had been pushed to the footnotes of history. Those complicated feelings often festered in the dark because in a family built on show business and public perception, hard truths were rarely discussed openly. Years later, Rosanne admitted that a lot of the frustration she directed at June wasn't really about June's actions at all. It was actually about her own deep-seated insecurities and a desperate hunger to find her footing in a family that felt too massive for her solitary voice. June, meanwhile, was shouldering her own heavy load, constantly fighting a war to keep Johnny alive, sober and somewhat grounded in reality. That exhaustingly full-time job often left her with very little emotional bandwidth to navigate the fragile, complex feelings of a stepdaughter. There were certainly times when Rosanne felt brushed aside instances where she was convinced her internal pain was completely invisible to the adults in the room. And yet as the years rolled on, she started to see that June was simply stretched to her limit, trying to balance an impossible lifestyle with an incredibly difficult man. Nevertheless, those unvoiced conflicts played a major role in shaping their bond-stitching threads of resentment and confusion, right alongside deep love and fierce loyalty. Rosanne has reflected on how during her younger, more volatile years, she likely judged June with too much severity. She viewed her as a competitor for her father's limited affection, rather than recognising her as the warrior woman who was literally keeping him alive for the sake of the entire family. That clarity is something that only arrived with age and separation, but at the time the tension was palpable and the silences were incredibly heavy. Rosanne admits that she dragged some of those silent wars into her own adulthood, often suppressing her honest emotions because she feared a blow-up or rejection. It was only with the passage of time that she realised June's occasional sternness was actually rooted in a deep protective love. She came to understand that June's firmness was a survival mechanism against the chaos, and what once felt like cold indifference was actually steel-clad resilience. Now in her 70s, as we look at this, in 2026, Rosanne has decided to speak candidly about those past frictions, framing them not as accusations, but as honest confessions. They are confessions of her own vulnerability and the misunderstandings that clouded her judgment during her youth. These were the quiet internal battles that helped forge her into the strong, independent woman she eventually became. For a long time, Rosanne Cash internally wrestled with her stance toward June Carter, viewing her simultaneously as a necessary anchor and a rival for her dad's attention. However, as time marched on and maturity softened her harsh outlook, she began to accept a truth that had been present the entire time. June loved her fiercely, but she did it in the only way she knew how. She wasn't a woman who wasted breath on fluff, nor was she the type to smother people with constant hugging. Her love was practical and expressed through action, small critical gestures that often went under the radar until years later, when Rosanne replayed the tapes in her mind. There were countless nights when June stayed awake with Johnny during his darkest drug-fueled hours to keep him safe. But just as frequently, she was checking in on the kids, ensuring they were secure and reminding them of their worth, even when their father's demons were consuming the household. Rosanne has shared that June was the one who constantly pushed her to trust her own gut instincts above all else. She taught her to believe in the power and validity of her own voice, even during moments of crippling self-doubt. Sometimes this support came in the form of a simple handwritten note of encouragement tucked where she would find it. Other times it was a serious conversation where June would remind her that true greatness isn't about chasing applause, but about standing rock solid in your own truth. These weren't always the loud cinematic declarations of affection Rosanne craved as a girl, but they were consistent, unshakable, and rooted in a loyalty she eventually recognised as truly maternal. As the years rolled on, it slowly dawned on Rosanne that calling June merely a stepmother was a massive understatement that didn't do the woman justice. In every single way that actually counted, she was a second mother, though admitting that truth to herself was a jagged pill to swallow for a long time. The epiphany didn't hit her all at once like a lightning bolt. It crept in gradually as Rosanne navigated the chaos of raising her own brood, finally grasping that love isn't a one-size-fits-all deal. She learned that some forms of love are quiet whispers, others are messy and flawed, but at the end of the day, every single one of them is the real deal. She started looking back and remembering how June's infectious cackle would cut through the gloom in a home that was way too familiar with heavy silences and deep despair. She recalled how that woman had a superpower, the ability to walk into a room and turn a living nightmare into a situation you could actually survive. Even back when Rosanne was putting up walls and giving her the cold shoulder, June never bailed. She kept showing up, kept caring, and kept hammering home the point that Rosanne was loved, whether she wanted to hear it or not. Now that she has hit the big 70, Rosanne has finally come clean, admitting that what she used to read as cold distance or bossiness was actually the protective shell of a woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. And hidden under that tough exterior was a heart massive enough to wrap around not just her husband, but the baggage and the children he brought along for the ride. Ultimately, the truth settled in Rosanne realised that June's affection wasn't some prize she had to fight for or a trophy she needed to win in a competition. It had been sitting right there the whole time, solid as a rock and completely unshakable, even if it took Rosanne a lifetime to open her eyes and actually see it. When the legendary June Carter Cash left this world in May of 2003, the entire globe felt the crushing loss of a true country music icon. But for Rosanne Cash, the heartbreak was a whole lot messier and more tangled than the public mourning of a superstar. June had worn so many hats in her life: the stepmom, the mentor, the fierce protector, the strict disciplinarian, and eventually the mother figure Rosanne desperately needed. Once she was gone, Rosanne was left holding a mixed bag of emotions, deep gratitude, sitting right next to stinging regret. She was grateful for the steel backbone June provided for years and for the way she practically dragged Johnny through personal hurricanes that would have flattened anyone else. But that was mixed with regret for the countless things left unsaid, the long stretches of silence over the decades, when Rosanne just couldn't bring herself to articulate what June really meant to her. In the aftermath of losing the matriarch, Rosanne described the feeling like the tectonic plates beneath the family had permanently shifted, leaving them on unstable ground. Johnny was absolutely wrecked his own health, taking a nosedive as he tried to exist in the long, dark shadow of her absence. The whole clan felt the crushing weight of a void that was simply impossible to fill, no matter how hard they tried. It was in that vacuum that Rosanne truly understood how June had been the anchor keeping them all from drifting away. It wasn't just about the music, the laughs, or the fame. It was that unwavering promise that no matter how crazy the celebrity life got, June was going to grab the wheel and steady the ride. Without her running the show, the silence in the house was loud enough to burst your eardrums. Rosanne started digging through the archives of her memory, hunting for those little moments she had ignored before, times when June's love screamed through her actions rather than her words. She replayed the subtle nudges of encouragement, the wisdom June dropped that Rosanne was too stubborn to appreciate until it was way too late to say, "Thank you." Losing June forced Rosanne to look in the mirror and deal with emotions she had been dodging and weaving around for years. It became agonisingly clear just how much of her own DNA, metaphorically speaking, was shaped by June's influence. It wasn't just about her music career, it was her grit as a woman. Rosanne put it perfectly when she said that death strips away the fake stuff and forces you to look at the truths you ignored while the person was still breathing. For her, the bottom line was actually pretty straightforward. June Carter had loved her ferociously, bet on her success, and played a massive role in moulding her into the woman standing there today. Admitting that was healing, sure, but it also brought a wave of sadness for the wasted time, for the moments when ego or stubborn silence kept her mouth shut. After the funeral, the floodgates opened and Rosanne started talking about her stepmother with a new kind of honesty. She stopped talking about the glitzy performer the fans idolised and started describing the real woman who held it down during the unglamorous hours, keeping the family ship afloat when it was taking on water. And while the pain of loss hung around it was matched by a profound sense of thanks. She was thankful that at least at the very end of the road she could finally admit just how monumental June was to her life story. Now at 70 years old, Rosanne Cash has finally found the guts to speak about June Carter with absolute clarity and zero hesitation. In doing so, she is letting the world in on a truth that she has been carrying around in her heart for decades. Time growing up and walking her own path have smoothed out the jagged edges of her childhood memories, so she is no longer looking at June through the lens of a rebellious daughter fighting for territory. Instead, she is seeing her through the eyes of a grown woman who knows exactly what it takes to love to sacrifice and to stick it out when things get hard. Rosanne confesses now that June was way more than just the woman her dad married. She was the iron pillar holding up a dynasty that easily could have crumbled under the massive pressure of fame and addiction. She remembers June's humour, her unshakable faith, and the way she owned every room she walked into, and she can finally say that June's love wasn't something that came with conditions. It was constant, bulletproof, and 100% genuine. Reflecting on it at 70, Rosanne admits that her silence back in the day was mostly about her own insecurities and internal battles. It was her own fear of admitting just how much she owed to a woman who didn't give birth to her, but who sure as hell helped raise her all the same. With a house full of her own kids and grandchildren, now Rosanne is starting to spot June's wisdom popping up in the most unexpected places. You can see it in the fierce way she mothers her tribe, the delicate balancing act she performs between her stardom and her private world, and especially in the grace she has found to forgive both herself and the people who hurt her. For the Nashville insiders and fans who spent decades speculating on the real drama between Rosanne and her famous stepmom, these new admissions are serving up some major revelations that double as a tear-jerking tribute. She is not trying to sweep the dirty laundry under the rug anymore. She is being completely open about the heavy tension, the silent battles, and those intense flashes of resentment that defined their complicated history. But she is laying it all out with brutal honesty, proving that real love is almost never a fairy tale, and that the strongest family bonds are usually forged in the fire of conflict just as much as they are in the happy moments. When it is all said and done, Rosanne has finally made her peace with the massive shadow June Carter cast, seeing her as so much more than just a legendary country music icon. She recognises her as the woman who gave her father a reason to battle his demons, and ironically as the force that gave Rosanne the grit she needed to find her own voice. Now at the age of 70, she has finally decided to crack the door wide open on the truth, admitting that June Carter was never just a stepmother figure. She was actually her greatest mentor, her guardian, and in every sense that truly matters when the cameras are off, she was her mother.